Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO of Cyvergence. Today, we're going to cover a primer on the threat landscape, part one. So this is part of the threat and vulnerability series. We've already covered the basic tools for threat and vulnerability programs. It's also going to cover things like vulnerability management, software security, and the list will go on. So in this particular version, we're going to cover a definition of the threat landscape, the technology context, the threat actors, breach patterns, and Cyvergent services. What will you learn? We're going to cover a basic definition of the threat landscape so you understand what we're talking about. We're going to look at how technology affects that threat landscape. We'll cover a high-level overview of the threat actors and some of the breach patterns. So a bit of housekeeping. We use very reputable sources for this information. It may be the case that sometimes that information may be contradictory, and that's for a variety of different reasons. It could be that the data sources are different from one another, but that's okay. It just means that there's going to be a little bit of flavor and there's a little bit of room for error because there's no such thing as perfect information. We're going to be moderately technical with some of this. I'm going to cover very high-level explanations, but it's definitely not an in-the-weeds type of talk today. This is also not an academic treatise. We're giving generalities as we're going through this. So we're not trying to be very specific on the dates because we're trying to get the general idea of why the threat landscape is so important. So let's go into a threat landscape definition. At a high level, when we talk about the cyber threat landscape, we're talking about the totality of threats an organization, a group, or a system may face. So this is related to cybersecurity. It's electronic, but it also can be physical, but also related to a whole country, or maybe it's just a particular organization. So this is all the different types of threat actors that are out there, looking at their motivations, the attack arsenal, and some of the trending information, which there is a tremendous amount of it today. But before we do, let's take a look at international law and the threat landscape because it has a tremendous impact on why we have some of the problems we have here today. Of course, there's the technology angle of it. But right now, we have roughly 156 countries that have cybercrime laws. So that leaves some of them that do not. And the content and the enforcement varies depending on those countries. And of course, you're going to find that. In a place like the United States, we're going to find some differences even between state and state. There are some cybercrime standards, however. Europe leads the way. They've created something called the Budapest Convention, which 68 countries, including the United States, has signed off on. So that provides a minimum baseline for countries to have in terms of dealing with laws within their country. If you go back 20 years ago, this is a completely different state now than we had back then. What we'd find is most of the countries didn't have strong cybercrime laws. So these have been developed over the last 20 plus years. But that's not the only factor in this. So the nation state's attitudes towards those external crimes matters very much. There's the internal focus of those crimes, but then there's the external. So, for example, many of the crimes that take place are from other countries. It's from one country to another country. And they have a little bit of protection with that because in some cases, those countries are going to go after the cyber criminals if we go to them. In other cases, they're going to completely ignore it. They're going to say, well, are they attacking our country? No, it's okay. And that's the way the nation states operate. But in some cases, though, you get nation states that are going to have full cooperation with any of these cyber criminals that are brought up. But sometimes they kind of accept it. It's not really their top priority, and they've got other things to deal with. In some cases, they actually enable the cybercrime. So they authorize it. Sometimes they pay for it. Sometimes they use the cyber criminals as a proxy. So the cyber criminals are creating the action, but they're giving the information back to the nation state as a way of hiding the crimes from taking place. So there's a lot going on when we're looking at those general attitudes towards cybercrime. But when you consider something like cyber espionage, where you've got a threat actors going in and attacking other corporations or other governments, that's a whole nother can of worms that we're dealing with today. So, for example, If it's the goal of the nation state to steal technology, they're going to, in many cases, go after the cyber criminals or go after the corporations, pull the information out, steal it, and bring it back to their country so they don't have to spend the millions of dollars developing the technology to begin with. You know, for a very small fee, they're able to leap ahead in that technology. So it is an important factor today when we're considering the threat landscape. The differences in the cybercrime laws greatly affects the threat landscape and the damage that these different threat actors can do. So obviously there is some sort of relationship going on between real world and the cybercrime world. Oftentimes these attack types are blended together, but not always. But that makes a lot of these attacks a lot more effective and a lot more devastating. And you're going to find that different types of crime start to blend in different ways between the cybercrime world. It's not always this one-to-one relationship as we start to explore it. So if we start on a very simple level, there's burglary. You know, this is somebody breaking into your house or into a corporation in order to steal something or possibly for other reasons. You know, hacking is kind of the equivalent of it, but it's breaking into a computer in a non-authorized fashion to get whatever you want out of the system. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this would take place, but also we need to look at things like deceptive calling. Now, in today's world, most of us have heard of phishing. Phishing is where they're going to go in and send you an email in order to get you to have a certain response. Oftentimes it's going to be fraud or committing identity theft or extortion, whatever that is. But then, of course, you have spear phishing, where you're targeting a very specific person. But then you have whaling, which is going after a C-level executive within an organization. But then you have things like farming. This is where you have a website into the equation. So sometimes you're going to find things like smishing, which is SMS phishing, combined with farming, where they'll send you a message saying, go to this website. You click on the website and it happens to be one you work for. So you think that it's all part of this greater deception for what's going on. Sometimes they're going to mix a call. So they'll send you a phishing email, but then you give you a phone call, say, hey, I'd like to follow up on this email. Looks like we've got an issue. We need you. I'm part of the tech support. It's part of this company. If you could click on this link, it would be greatly appreciated. Then we can gain access to your computer. So that's a huge issue for organizations today. Also, you've got things like extortion, which unfortunately does take place, but now we've got extortion over the internet. And there's a lot of different forms of extortion taking place. You have things like deep fakes, where you're starting to see artificial intelligence. You're seeing people that are being brought into this, that are creating different challenges. So it makes it look like somebody's doing something when they had never performed that task before. There's even websites out there, they're able to make it seem like you can speak a different language and when you can't speak the language at all. And that's yet another challenge for organizations today and for individuals. So there's a lot going on here. Fraud, of course, you can have fraud and internet fraud. Fraud can take place in multiple places. And sometimes, so you're going to get identity theft mixed with fraud. So identity theft can take place anywhere. But if you're able to pull the information off of the internet through some source, maybe they don't have MFA, multi-factor authentication, you log in, pull the information in, it allows you to commit fraud. So in some cases, say in the healthcare sector, one of the big things that's going on is you'll find identities being compromised. They pull in some cyber insurance information, which they stole from someplace else, and then they'll go in proposing in that particular person in order to commit a crime, in order to get, surgeries done or whatever, and that can go back and affect the original person because it looks like they had the surgery when clearly they did not. So this is definitely a huge issue when you start to look at the blending of all of these different types of crimes. But let's also take a look at the technology context here. So we're going to start with computing. And again, these are not exact times, so they're general ideas in order to get to. So you had mainframes. They were first being developed. They were as large as rooms are. So there's a lot that's going on there. Then we ended up with personal computers. You had different variations of operating systems and things like that. Eventually, we developed laptops. And then we developed Internet of Things. So those who are not familiar with it, think of a refrigerator as a thing, or a toaster, or there's a whole bunch of things, cameras or other options. They're basically a thing that's in your house that a person isn't interacting with on a day-by-day basis. Then you have cloud computing. These are connections that are in other people's systems that are out there. It's a lot more complicated. The definition of that can take quite a while, but most of us have a general idea of what cloud computing really is. But then you have things like iPads and smartphones and things like that. And eventually cloud had its own types of technology starting to build into it. An example of that would be containers. So what you're seeing here from a computing standpoint, it has gotten very complex. You could even add virtualization into it. So what you're seeing here from a landscape perspective, there is a lot more for us to protect than we had 20 some years ago. We didn't have smartphones 20 years ago. So now it's a whole new vector to consider. But let's go into some of the connecting capabilities here. So we find things like modems, bulletin board systems, email, and there's a lot of different types of connectivity. Modems, for those who remember, you had a dial-up on a regular phone. You logged into a particular system, say a bulletin board system or another computer, in order to connect in and have the type of connectivity that you want. This is pre-internet days. And of course, you had DSL, ADSL, all these different types of connectivity technologies. Ethernet is one of the latest iterations, but there's other types out there as well. But from a practical standpoint, though, you had Wi-Fi connectivity. So this would be how you're connecting into your Wi-Fi device in order to pull that information in. You also had things like USB connectivity. And there's several variations of stuff that was out over the years. Now you have near field communication, NFC. That's where you're able to have a localized connection where you might be able to tap it and get in. And some of the modern systems, like here in New York City, that's how you can pay for a lot of your subway rides today. It's with a near field communication device that happens to be embedded in the phone today. But you, of course, have Bluetooth. Bluetooth is another way that you're going to connect into different devices. That's on something called a personal area network. It's another type of wireless technology. So now we've got at least 4 types of wireless technology, if you also include the cellular technology that cell phones typically go over. Other concerns are things like Bluetooth, and then of course you've got consumer grade VPNs. Now, we also had Tor that was invented. For those who are not familiar with it, it is a way to bypass modern technology. There's a lot to go into it. We're going to cover it in the next part 2 of this particular series, but it's a way that a lot of people have connected in to go get things on the dark web or in other cases. But it's a way to bypass a lot of the protections that are out there on the standard internet. But that's not the only factor when you're starting to look at things. You've got open source software, which at the time was fantastic. It still is a brilliant idea, and it's saving us so much development time for every single company, because what you have software that most companies are using to develop whatever it is they're working from. Then they take that open source software and they don't have to redevelop the wheel every single time they're starting to do something. You take an existing capability, download the open source software, and start to make use of it. Of course, this creates a whole nother set of challenges. In the early days, you didn't have very many risks related to things, but now you've got a tremendous number of risks related to open source software. And so this becomes a fairly sizable challenge that corporations need to contend with. So we have websites. They're definitely a thing that had developed over time, and DNS went along with that. That's the domain name service. That's what allows us to go to, say, Amazon.com rather than going to a particular IP addresses or set of IP addresses related to a particular company. It's extremely useful, but it's also been compromised in a variety of ways and used to create different types of attacks on the internet. Eventually, we ended up with Web 2.0. This is where we've got different types of technologies such as media. Like the technology I'm working over right now is considered Web 2.0 because it's going to be available, and this is where you can watch videos and do all kinds of fantastic things. Eventually, we ended up with blockchain technology. This is for cryptocurrencies, utilizing a lot of blockchain and ways of working with things across people's phones, etc. And some of that is now being harvested by the dark web because they believe they can break the encryption related to blockchain at a later point in time. Of course, you've got Web 3.0. Now, there are some early precursors to what we find today. Today, usually it's considered meta, but all of these things need to be protected. We have different development languages as it going on. You've got artificial intelligence. that's got large language models today for where this stuff is. It's not true artificial intelligence, but a step towards that. But every single change that we have, whether you're talking about computing, you're talking about basic operating systems, whether you're talking about VPNs or internet, near field communication, all of these things are more things to be concerned about for modern organizations. But let's take a step back though. So you see in the darker blue down here, the non-IoT devices. Think of these as computers, laptops, servers, just some basic technology that most of us are familiar with. We've been between 8 and little above 10 billion devices every year for many years now. But what we've seen starting to grow pretty sizably is IoT, those toasters and cameras and other things, because there's a lot of other use cases for IoT devices. Now in 2023, we're roughly at 2-to-1 ratio of IoT devices to non-IoT devices. By 2025, we're going to be at roughly 3-to-1 ratio. So what's interesting about that is IoT has a ton of problems with it. Many times you can't install antivirus software on it. It isn't protected properly. It's designed poorly using old security problems with it, with old technology components that are being brought into it. And that creates a whole nother set of challenges because it can't be protected by traditional means. There's also a lot of application numbers, though. There's over 35 million Windows application, over 800,000 in the Windows Store, over 3 million in Google Play, 2 million in Apple Store. Amazon has roughly over 450,000. So there are a lot of applications that are out there. So you've got just a massive number of applications, and the quality of these applications is very different. Every place is going to be a little bit different in terms of how they're going to protect those applications. But all of this just adds to the complexity of understanding what the risks are, because some of these are going to have, very old vulnerabilities. There's a lot of challenges that are going on with it. But all of this starts to affect that threat landscape because there's a lot to protect today. Let's go ahead and take a look at the threat actors. So this is kind of my take on it. I'm going to start with the tinkerers in this particular case, but I'm generally going to work from left to right. The tinkers, that's my version of what hacker used to be. Hacker used to be a positive term, and it would be people who would be tinkering with change. They're kind of curious how to take things apart and how to put things together again. That was kind of the original idea of what hacker meant. It was a very positive thing. Eventually, it kind of grew into something else. Now, for those who are deep into the hacker terminology, many people refer to them as having different types of hats. You've got the white hat hacker, which are the ones that are authorized and they're doing good things for a good reason. You've got the blue hats, which are being paid to go do things and hack other organizations. And again, it's authorized. You got the gray hats, the green hats, the black hats, which are unauthorized. So the term hacker has really morphed into a negative when it really was a positive to begin with. But let's go ahead and go into this from the left-hand side. So from an insider perspective, these are people working within an organization to cause different types of issues. So in some cases, we need the uninformed or the careless insider. They make a mistake or they didn't know they weren't supposed to use password 1234 as a password today. You need to do training and make sure you've got technology that's going to catch these kinds of issues that are going on. So all of these are part of that bigger picture. You have maliciousness as well. So this is an insider who's maybe disgruntled, or maybe you've got somebody who's blackmailing them into doing something where they have to do something bad within their organization, or they want to, depending on the context. So that's where somebody is truly trying to do something to throw a monkey wrench into things, or to steal data or something else. So insiders are definitely a big cause for concern within organizations today. But let's take a look at the miscellaneous. I started talking about the gray hats as briefly as I was talking about the tinkers. The gray hats are people who know they're not supposed to do certain things, but they do it anyway, or they kind of have some level of consent. For example, a lot of companies today, they have a program where gray hat hackers are authorized to attack them, but then they can do something called responsible disclosure, and they can let the company know, hey, by the way, I found this vulnerability. And either A, they're going to get paid, or maybe they're going to be up on a wall saying, hey, here's some fantastic hackers. Here are top ones. Here's the number of vulnerabilities they found. And it allows companies to respond in an appropriate way to whatever vulnerabilities are out there. But also in that miscellaneous category, the beginners. These are the people just figuring out how do you do different types of attacks. These are people testing with phishing or testing with some of these other capabilities. And this is where things are right now. They're just learning to play around with that. And a lot of people talk about artificial intelligence and how that's playing into it. These are people just learning how to do some of the basics today. And artificial intelligence is going to help push them along a little bit because it's able to write some of the code for them so they don't have to go too far. It's not something I'm tremendously concerned about because generally speaking, they're not the advanced attackers. There might be a few cases where they'll go a little bit further, but there are tools they can download off of the internet, the dark web in particular, where they can create malware on the fly. It's already part of the threat landscape for what we're dealing with today. But more concerning than what you're seeing under the miscellaneous is the ideologues. These are things like the terrorists. Now, luckily, with exceptions, most organizations don't have to deal with terrorist attacks. It's just occasionally if they feel like there's something going on that's very negative. But you also have hacktivists. These are a little bit more concerning, and they will get involved in cases where they feel there's something moral. They feel like an immoral action has taken place on the part of either a government, a person, or an organization, and then they will go after it. Now, a lot of times these are like distributed denial of service attacks. These are things where they're going to get a whole bunch of people, they get together, they say, yep, we all agree with this particular moral imperative, and then they decide to do hacking against organizations, which can cause a tremendous amount of damage. So they are definitely a concern, but they're not the largest concern for most organizations. The biggest concern that most organizations have is on APTs, advanced persistent threats. These are things like nation states. So a nation state is going to be an attacker that's coming in, and they're authorized to do so. Usually they're very big budgets. They have developers who are able to do things. Like a nation state example is Stuxnet. Stuxnet was going after Iran by going after some of the centrifuge devices without going too far into that story. But that's an example of a nation state attack. There are a lot of others that are taking place as well. But the other side of the house is organized crime. This is another really big concern because they've got a lot of resources, and there are a lot of different threat actor groups that are in the organized crime family when you look at things globally. But in general, this is my take on the threat actors and the kind of people that you need to be concerned about across an organization. When you're looking at what are the different types of threats and what are their motivations, which we'll touch on a little bit. But before we do that, I want to touch on the cybercrime groups. I have seen some reports from, this 1,900 different cybercrime groups that are out there, all the way through 3,500 different groups. So this is clearly way beyond just governments. There is not even 1,000 governments across the globe when you talk about nation states. But there definitely is a lot of concern. Here you can see some of the financial, the APTs, et cetera. So there's a lot of different groups that are going on here. And this is just a tip of the iceberg, and these grow and change. Sometimes they dissolve or form back together again. So there is some change across these groups, but a lot of them do have their standardized tools, techniques, and practices that they're using as part of their cybercrime group. So cybercrime is a very real problem today. So this comes in from Statistica, that roughly by the end of this year, which is almost over, there is almost $11.5 trillion in cybercrime going on across the whole planet. So if it were a country, that would be the third largest GDP behind the US and China. 4 years from now, this could be double that. So the problems of cybercrime might be larger than countries at a certain point down the road. We're not there yet, but it is something that's growing. It's a severe concern for most countries because anybody can be targeted, from particular individuals to countries. But let's take a look at some of the threat actors and the sources. If you look over on the left-hand side, we have threat actor sources and breaches. You see, typically it's external. It's not the internal actor. So the internal actors are something to be concerned about because it definitely does happen. Occasionally you have a partner involved, but What's more interesting is when you're talking about a breach, it's multiple partners and not just a single partner is more common than a standard partner. But if you're looking at the particular actors, you want to get into nation state affiliated, you see that it's a fairly small slice, the yellow there over there. Organized crime is most common. And then you have other being a whole variety of different things and sometimes end users. That's definitely a concern for organizations, generally speaking. Your particular organization may vary. So when you look at motivation, typically you're going to find that it's financial. The lighter blue that you see up there, up towards the top, that's grudge. So sometimes they do things because they're not happy. But espionage, other, and ideology are the lesser concerns for most attacks. Let's go ahead and jump into a few different types of breach patterns. So we'll look into some of that information. If you're looking at the data types here, you can see that personal internal information and credentials is about 75% of the data. So this means that identity is a huge part of attacks these days because they're able to reuse it. They go from one location to another location because they're pulling in that data. So taking a look at the information sources is absolutely critical. But you can see here too, in the yellow towards the left-hand side of the circle, that's system information. But you're finding sometimes internal information too. So they want to know about your individual system so they can go report this. It gets put back on the dark web somewhere, along with some of the internal information. Sometimes they're trying to hack different types of data and things like that. But sometimes it's about the landscape of your internal organization from a technology standpoint. So there is a lot to go into here. So top action varieties, you can see here that stolen credentials is very, very common in breaches. So when you see like a gaming site hacked, for example, they will take those accounts and then they will reuse them because people have a tendency of reusing the same password over and over and over again. And breaches are one of the end result of reusing those passwords. You have things like ransomware that's going on. Ransomware is not as big of a problem as people think it is. People hear about it in the news over and over again, but you're seeing it's roughly in the 20% of the time range you're going to find ransomware. It's just not the concern that people claim that it is. But you find other, so there's a lot of random stuff that's going on as well. But then we have a listing of other stuff: privilege abuse, misdelivery, backdoor, or C2. Now, C2 stands for command and control. This is basically where they put a piece of malware onto a system and it has a backdoor, which allows attackers to come in and go directly into that attack. So there's a lot going on here, but these are some generalities for the top action varieties in breaches, most common actions that are taking place by attackers. Now, when we're considering something like the assets, more often than not, they're going after the servers. Occasionally people will be involved, so you're seeing that's about 20% of the time, then sometimes the user devices. Now, again, the person might be knowing or unknowing for what's actually taking place. So if you're talking about physical, well, maybe somebody's sending out emails that were to the wrong people and they've got some sensitive data in it or to a wrong organization. That technically is a breach by a lot of legal definitions that are out there and needs to be reported as such. So when you start to look at these things, though, this gives you an idea for what you need to protect. You need to look at the user devices and you need to look at protecting the people, making sure they understand what's going on in the servers. Yes, network devices can be compromised. It's very infrequent. Terminal, same thing. Media, like USB devices, absolutely it happens. It's just not the most common thing. So it gives you an idea how and where you want to focus your energy. So this is an incident pattern. A breach is different where data is exfiltrated. Now there's some legal definitions because every place I've worked at, they've had a slightly different definition of what is a breach. But generally speaking, when we're talking about incidents, these are things that occur that a company needs to respond to, and it's not an insignificant one. So denial of service is a pretty major one. You can see that if we go on the right-hand side, that's 2023, it's roughly in the 40% range. System intrusions, you're looking at 25% of the time. There's something that takes place, but it doesn't actually mean that it becomes a breach. But there's web application attacks, social engineering, where somebody's pretending to do something in order to get you to come in. Phishing attacks are a good example of a social engineering attack. lost and stolen assets, so things that are stolen. You can see there's definitely a lot of different patterns, but you get the general sense of how and where you should be focusing your energy and your time. So the breach patterns. This is where you're taking a look at the same patterns, but taking a look from a breach perspective, not an incident perspective. So a system intrusion, for example, is a very good place. This is where somebody gets inside of the system from a hacking or malware perspective. They get in there and they do what they want within the organization. Of course, web application attacks are very common in breaches, as well as social engineering. This means that the human element is extraordinarily important. You're looking at roughly 20% of the time, you've got some sort of element of social engineering related to the breach. Errors are very common too. People making mistakes, privilege misuse, big part of that, lost and stolen assets. There's a lot of things that are going on here from a breach perspective. But now we're going to back up a little bit. We're going to take a look at the threat arsenal. These are the tools that threat actors have at their disposal to accomplish whatever goals they're going to be looking at from a cybersecurity perspective. In the early days, we'd find early computer threats. These are things like logic bombs, where system resources would be built up by creating something that's going to be continually ongoing. So there's a lot of different options that are out there. There's a lot of different ways that they're going to be approaching this. So things like pirated software. So that's a risk. And in fact, that's sort of an interesting one because it deals with the first time that you saw viruses. It wasn't until the 80s when first company said, you know what, we're seeing our software pirated throughout different places. We don't like that. So what they did is they created a virus within their own software that would cause problems unless people decided to pay, either uninstalled or paid for the software. So it was intended somewhat as a quasi good thing, but it still paved the way for other types of viruses and malware, worms, etc., down the road as well. So this is all part of that big picture of what are they able to do. Trojans sounds exactly what it is. If you're not familiar with it, think of the Trojan horse, where they have something out there that looks like it's somewhat good, but it's got something bad on it. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. There's something called streaming, for example. You might find a good application, but they put another file on top of it. And then when you launch the first file, it launches the second file, which causes something bad to happen on your computer, whether it's taking over. And there's been a huge evolution for a lot of the stuff. So if you take a look at some of the early threats, they were very noisy. You take a look at the I love you or, virus. It would come up and say something within Word, and that created a problem. It was something that was there. They're just kind of toying and figuring things out. But eventually what happened was this turned into a real obvious avenue for finance for cybercrime organizations. Companies or cyber criminal organizations moved from being, the thugs that you heard about back in the 1920s through being a cyber criminal organization today, where they're very careful about what they do. Sometimes they're attacking from one country to another. Sometimes they're attacking within a country, but they're using cybercrime as their sole source of information. But they're using things like the viruses, the malwares, worms, etc. But a lot of this stuff has changed greatly over the years. So you had polymorphic viruses, polymorphic malware. This is where it would change and be able to adapt from one type of system to another. This means that you could plug in your cell phone into your computer. So you could have, like, say, an Apple phone and a Windows computer, plug it in, and all of a sudden the malware can hop from one device to another. That was some of the early iterations that we were seeing. Eventually, we also had metamorphic malware. This is where, so kind of back up a little bit here, antivirus defenses, especially a long time ago, were signature-based. They'd find a problem, and then they would compromise, and they'd block something from taking place. But metamorphic malware, what it would do, it would change its signature. So the traditional signatures that you'd find were no longer valid because they'd be looking for something specific. So what happened is this spawned a whole change of the approach of antivirus vendors over the course of the last several years to get something a little bit better and a little bit better. So metamorphic was a huge change for organizations, and sometimes they develop old pieces of software that are very different on a per organization basis. For example, I was at a briefing. An FBI agent was talking about this, but one organization was going into Dropbox, and what happened was the cyber criminals had malware that would go there, go into Dropbox, pull something down, it would explode. It would go to another system, go get a different piece of malware, it would explode. So every system had a completely different type of malware and was bypassing all the defenses, all the antivirus defenses within the organization. With modern technology, now you can kind of catch some of the stuff, hopefully. The advanced persistent threats that we're talking about, the nation state actors, they can sometimes get around that because they know that's an issue. And this is always going to be an issue. Like there was a compromise at a major vendor a few years ago, and that person was releasing what are the tolerances for detecting these things. So they'd figure out how to write the malware that would not be noticed by the advanced threat detection engines. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on here, and the cyber criminal world becomes very interesting. And of course, you had things like Metasploit. Metasploit is a tool for being able to hack organizations. It's used by good people to try to attack it, to try to figure out if it can compromise. In fact, that's one of the big detectors for people who are in the threat and vulnerability space from a penetration testing standpoint. It probably can be exploited if it happens to exist in Metasploit. There's been a lot of changes with that over the years, but that's just one tiny aspect of things. There's, Metasploit. There's Shodan as well. It's basically saying, hey, are we detecting anything out there within your organization by looking at a set of IP addresses? Shodan will start to pick up on that, and it's free for anybody to use. They do have a paid version of it as well, so you don't have to sit there and go back and look all the time, but it has some information that's there. Malware advertising is what that's short for. But this is the term. This is where you have advertising from malware, and perfectly legitimate sites will fall for this. So what happens is they're using a third party to go get advertising. They're not always building the advertising themselves. Other companies pay for that, but sometimes you get a bad actor who's paying for advertising and it's got malware in it. So you can go to a very respectable site, do something called just moving your mouse over. It's called a mouse over in JavaScript, but then it collects gets the malware, it gets downloaded to your computer, and all of a sudden you've got an infection you didn't know about. Now you also had the IoT supply chain attack. This is like the Mirai botnet. This was done by a few kids that were kind of just experimenting around and ended up taking out a good chunk of the East Coast from a network perspective. It's all because the IoT was compromised. And the supply chain also starts to get into some other things too that I was starting to talk about, because the software gets compromised when you're talking about the freeware software that can be downloaded. And of course, you got ransomware and associated extortion. So what happens is with ransomware these days, as that started to evolve over time, is you would get a particular system that's going to be compromised. But before they do that, they're going to pull out some data. Then they go to the company and say, it will pay us because they've locked the system up. That's where ransomware comes in. But then let's say the company decides, oh, we're just gonna redo it anyway. And they said, well, we've got your data. Here's the data. Here's proof that we have your data. So if it's got your data, what do you do about that? Well, then all you can do is pay to get them to shut up. But sometimes they're going to go another step. Like, great, you paid us to shut up about it. Now we're going to go to one of your business partners. So you go to your business partner and find out what the issues are. You tell them, hey, we've got their data. We think this is your data that came in from you. And all of a sudden they are going back to the original company that was compromised and saying, why do we have this threat actor coming to us? So it's a huge issue for a lot of organizations today. But anyway, you can see that there's a lot of changes that are going on. I mean, there's so much more that you can go into in terms of the threat arsenal. But basically most anything that you can think of can probably be done today. A lot of the free cloud services, there's somebody wants to sign up for it, they go into it, boom, they've got access, they do whatever they want. There is just so much going on when you look at the threat arsenal that it's a challenge for us to deal with today. We can't continually use the old school technologies to be able to detect things that are most problematic. So when you talk about the vectors, this is another interesting one. Email is, very common. And a vector would be, what is their method of attack? Are they gaining access via email? Are they using a backdoor? Their desktop sharing software? All of these types of things. Direct install in some cases. So we can see that web applications, again, are pretty common. There's desktop sharing software, but sometimes you get the carelessness, people making mistakes, and that's where the action vector comes in. So there's a lot to consider from this perspective. This one is from a different source, and it kind of gives you another perspective on risk. And it shows very clearly that you've got some difference of data here. But you notice here, we see phishing at 37% is common for the initial vector, along with software vulnerabilities being the initial vector. So this would be something that's vulnerable, that the compromise takes place. And if you think about it from a web application perspective, for companies that have strong web application tools, this is something key that you need to focus on. Of course, you're looking at brute forcing credential attacks, previously compromised credentials. There's still a lot of other ways that companies can be compromised today. So let's take a look at some of the Cyvergent services. Obviously, we have risk services. The risk services that we have can be threat informed. We're going to take a look at some of the data that's out there and figure out how important is this for your organization, or what is the key thing. And it's going to help us to prioritize what you need to do based on that threat information. Virtual CISO services, of course, are going to be using this. So you can, again, try to tell you how should you focus your energy if you want to go down that route. Threat vector analysis. So I just talked a little bit about the threat vectors and what to do. We'll take a look at the various threat vectors for your organization, do a deep dive analysis on what you have in place, and try to determine what is your risk based on that threat vector. So if you're interested in something like that, we can do that. Also, we have direct sales. We have threat intelligence platforms, threat intelligence data. But of course, there's a lot of indirect sales where threat intelligence is actually built into the product. And this is true for many vulnerability management tools, security operations center services, antivirus, intrusion detection. All of this stuff is built into it. So there's a lot going on in the world of the threat landscape, but we're here to help you. We'll help you make sense of it and recommend what are the best things that you can do for your organization. So I'd like to thank everybody. Feel free to follow us on YouTube if you like this. Click like and definitely join the platform to make sure that you're getting more content like this. But follow us on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, or Facebook, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. I want to thank everybody for their time, and hopefully I'll hear from you soon. Thank you.